For those who have careers that keep them out at sea, for long periods of time, what is the creepiest thing you've seen out in the water? Not so much creepy, as eerie, but being out in the blue at night in a lightning storm in a slack wind. The ocean was very flat, no big rolling swells, just tiny little ripples. The whole world would be black, and then there would be a flurry of bolts, and the whole world would be silver. The ocean looked like nothing so much as aluminium foil that had been scrunched up, and flattened out. The water looked like mercury, and all the little ripples made these very dramatic black shadows. This sort of qualifies. Former Navy here. Somewhere off the coast of Italy saw a very, very small boat, not much bigger than a rowboat, about 9 or 10 miles offshore. This was sometime around midnight. There was no light from land, and no other ships around. It had a light. Our ship captain said it was a fisherman, and the fish would be attracted to the light at that time. Imagine being in a rowboat about 10 miles offshore in the middle of a pitch-black night, waiting to see what finds you. User replies. Watched a documentary about a marine biologist who hypothesized the reason we have no giant squid sightings while on deep dives is their fear of man-made light. His way to test it? He'd take one of those two-man subs where the entire front was a large plexiglass-like bubble down off Monterey Bay and drop down to the bottom of the ocean. It drops down to 8K right off the coast. Then he turned off every light in the sub, and just sat there looking out the front bubble in the literal pitch-black darkness at the bottom of the Pacific for hours, just waiting. Fuck that. User replies. I would fucking love that. Stealth mode while a giant sea monster floats right by sounds so awesome. User replies. Yeah, if I could be guaranteed that the sub won't pull an OceanGate, it sounds like a relaxing evening. Empty boat far out at sea. User replies. One time on an airport trip my Uber driver was saying that he used to do security on tankers. That they would run across empty vessels more than you could possibly imagine, just floating, contents undisturbed, wallets, photos, everything. They would hail them with no response, and, not knowing if it was a trap to get close enough to take over the ship, pirates and ransoming the ship is apparently also more common than you'd think. Not the people though. Just the cargo. Anyway, the security team would have to board the ghost ship and scope out the situation. Even yachts, when there was no one aboard, they would sink them to avoid floating strike risks. I was like, surely there is some kind of finder's fee, and he was like, who are you going to call? Made me really wish a John Krakauer or Sebastian Junger would sink his teeth into that story. It would be a hell of a book. Edit. It seemed like there was no central body to call to salvage it. You're in international waters, so there's no coast guard. He implied that anyone who lost track of a ship like that likely lacked the resources/desire to retrieve it. I imagine the ship recorded in their log when they came across other vessels, but whether that information goes up to some authority, I don't know. Being myself in supply chain management, I know that oceanic shipping can be seriously sketchy, so although I can't corroborate the story, and part of why I posted was to see if it scared up any similar stories, it was related to me as fact, and didn't strike me as a tall tale. User replies. Next time he finds a yacht, tell him to message me because it's mine and I forgot where I parked it. I used to be an oil field diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I'd say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night. Mostly 500 feet and under DSVs. It's very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing in-water decompression in the middle of night. I'd always ask topside to turn off my headlight. Like a worm on a hook. Just bobbing in the darkness. User replies. Not even nearly as extreme as your story, but it evoked a memory. I did a scuba diving open water course and then did the advanced course, which included a night dive in a freshwater lake. I was only 5 m underwater, pitch black darkness with 2 other guys. We were on a platform and we could either face the dam wall or the open water, and I turned to the open water while the other guys were behind me. I turned off my light. We did have little lights on our backs. Just the deepest, calmest dark I've ever felt and seen. Not a single source of light anywhere, just immense darkness. Still remember that feeling, and it was like 15 years ago. User replies. Now that's spooky. You ever have anything bump into you in the pitch black? User replies. I've heard a story of an oil field diver, don't know if true. He said he once felt a current while down there and believed it was something very large that created it while swimming by. Some 20 years ago. On the MV Explorer, since sunk, down near the Antarctic Circle, sailing around the bergs and occasionally making landfall. We rounded into a small bay area, and there, amongst the ice and coast was an unmarked sailing yacht. Which is odd, as generally yachts have some identifying markings on them. To add to it, they didn't respond to any radio contact, and whilst I wasn't privy to the conversation, and it was a long time ago, some crew went across via Zodiac and were refused boarding. So basically a yacht, not a particularly large one, that was unmarked, was hanging around in the inhospitable waters of the Antarctic and didn't want any help or contact. Proper weird. User replies. This one threw me for a loop, as I had a friend who did semester at sea on the MV Explorer, but thankfully different ships. I am a recreational sailor who travels for weeks at a time at sea. I once saw a flame on the water not 10 yards from me. Just freaking burning at midnight. User replies. Ocean fires are a rare phenomenon that occur when flammable gases seep out of the seafloor and ignite upon contact with oxygen in the water. These fires are not a new discovery, as they have been documented for centuries. Surely weird as fuck though. The bioluminescent animals, or whatever they are, in the water is pretty amazing. Our toilet would fill up with seawater, and if you took a piss in it in the middle of the night, it would agitate the water and it would glow sometimes. User replies. Always love the bioluminescence flickering around the hull at night. They're almost like a cushion of little stars guiding you safely along. On those really dark, moonless nights, I'd almost beg for them to arrive. I sailed 70 feet yacht around the world a few years back. Southern Ocean, Cape Horn, Good Hope, Roaring Forties, Furious 50s, 2 equatorial crossings, the full deal. Plenty of terrifying moments, boring moments, funny moments, and beautiful moments. A creepy moment that is burned into my memory involved a near catastrophe halfway between New Zealand and Cape Horn. We ended up hitting really bad weather and absolutely huge seas, 50 feet swells with massive troughs in between. We were running with the swells for days as they grew, skidding down them like a bloated surfboard, always worrying that the next wave would break behind us and roll us over. At night it's pitch black down there in bad weather, the sky and sea just form a huge black mass. The most terrifying thing is the sound of an invisible wave breaking behind you. At night, you run red light to preserve night vision, so there's basically just an eerie red glow emanating from below deck. At about 2 in the morning, I was at the helm when a monster wave broke directly over the back of us without a second's warning. Time slowed down like it does in those moments, and the last thing I saw was my own silhouette in the wall of water, lit up like an ominous red snow angel, and then nothing but cold blackness as the boat sunk into the sea. Fortunately, she popped straight back up like a cork after a few eternal seconds, almost like a submarine surfacing, and we were still in one piece. Still can't forget that glowing red apparition of myself though. The memory of it has woken me up in a cold sweat more than once. I was on a 32-foot speedboat and got caught by nightfall in between islands. No night lights on the boat, navigating using GPS and depth finder. Captain knew the way like the back of his hand since he'd sailed those waters since he was a kid, but for me it was my first time in the middle of the ocean at night. Pitch black but for the stars. As above so below, it seemed as if the boat was floating in the blackest void of the universe. Years later I saw the movie Life of Pi, and the scene where Pi is in his lifeboat floating in the dark among the stars, no above no below. It was exactly like that. I still have dreams about that night. The engulfing dark and the silence that was not silent. Surreal. We made it safely to port. Captain fitted the night lights on that boat the day after. User replies. Some people will never experience what no light pollution is like. There are so many stars. Although the sound of water smashing against the ship is terrifying. I worked on the sailboat one summer in the Bahamas, and something that you see a lot when you're in the ocean is kayaks and life jackets floating around, and you always radio them in, but they always just fell off a yacht or something and it's never a big deal. Once we found a kayak floating and it had a fishing rod in the rod holder, which basically meant someone was using it. Edit. Didn't see how viral this went overnight. Some people were asking questions. The Coast Guard doesn't really even look into this stuff, unless there is a confounding report, so we never received an update. Not that I would have expected one unless there was a full-scale search. We went up close to it and it had the removable seat cushion still in, which further convinced us that someone had been using it. There was nothing else to see, the line was in the water, but we never really revisited it. We tried not talk about it because the kids on the boat got creeped out after the adults kinda freaked out and didn't control their emotions. User replies. I was about 2 km offshore Western Australia kayak fishing in the middle of nowhere. Knocked a rod overboard and didn't hesitate to take off my life jacket to dive in and get it. I chased it down a good distance before giving up. When I got back to the surface, the kayak was now a good 15 to 20 meters away, thanks to way more wind present than I'd realized. I barely managed to swim back to it, giving everything I had as it continued to get blown away. Was very nearly the end for me that day over a stupid fishing rod and a rash decision. Edit. Never anticipated such a response. For my encore, same Washington road trip, somewhere south of Karata. Was the day after Australia Day, and I was carrying a mighty hangover, 46 degrees Celsius / 115 Fahrenheit. There's not much of anything in between towns out that way. A detour had been set up to direct cars off the main road to avoid a bush fire. I turned off as per that sign, but didn't come across any other directions. The dirt track I was now on headed in the direction of the smoke. I kept going, expecting a turn in another direction any moment. As I drove over another crest, I could see not just smoke but the actual flames of the fire front now. Obviously this wasn't the intended detour. So I hastily turned my van around, blissfully unaware as to how soft and sandy the edge of the dirt road was. Bogged to the axles, uncomfortably close to the bushfire. About an hour of trying unsuccessfully to dig the van out, I started the hike out to anywhere I might find help, and I'd seen nothing but desert for at least 20 kilometers. I cleverly made a trolley out of my 2 paddle halves and kayak wheels so I could take 20 liters of water with me, but in my panic stupidly forgot that I had an APIRB satellite beacon for exactly this kind of scenario. Eventually rescued by a fire crew putting up road closed signs a couple hours later. You already made it halfway through the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Let's continue. A dead human body. It was the tropics and it wasn't in good shape. We turned it over to the authorities at nearest land. There were enough teeth left to identify it by dental records. Here's hoping the man's family got closure. User replies. I had that happen to me while surfing. Me and a few others were sitting at a point break when a body just floats around the rocky point and right into us. He had drowned about 3 days prior, so it wasn't pretty. User replies. Oh God, that is horrifying. I'm now imagining swimming around in dark water and suddenly I'm faced with a bloated white corpse. User replies. My wife had the same reaction when we went night swimming off Costa Rica. I know I'm not in the best of shape, but quite frankly, I was a bit offended. Somewhere in the Atlantic, nice cold as fuck night, decided to step out and look at stars. About 10 minutes on and a boat's mast pops up, sits there a few minutes and then back under. No alarms, nothing. Just some sub boys getting a bit of late night O2 in the middle of nowhere next to some friends. User replies. I think people underappreciated how chilling it must be to have a sub / near you. I've been in a boat in areas they're known to be present, generally speaking, and just looking into the water thinking of it under there freaks me the fuck out. Not sure why, just some folks doing their job. Those vessels are terrifying though. User replies. God damn. I didn't realize you meant a sub-mast at first, and was imagining it being a white fiberglass mast, attached to a boat that came up, and then sank back down. Somehow that was far more disturbing. In 20 years the weirdest shit I've seen is other people that work out here. There's about 40% of the sailors like what they do and are good at it. Another 40% that are good at it, but would do something better if the money was right. But there's another 20%. If they lived ashore for more than 6 months a year they'd end up dead or incarcerated. There's no more west for them to go to, so they went offshore and became our problem. User replies. Love that turn of phrase. There's no more west for them. I've known some seamen and get exactly what you mean. Literally drifted and or were chased straight off the continents. User replies. I cannot claim it, and I don't recall where it came from. A book or comedian talking about how crazy people end up jammed against the shore on the west coast. That for centuries there was always a west, where wanderers, vagabonds, and weirdos could go to. A frontier where they would be accepted or at least tolerated. The last west was Alaska. After that they went to sea. I have a friend who works on ships. He said the single scariest thing he had ever seen was looking out a window and seeing a wave that he said looked like it was 100 meters high pass right by their boat and suddenly disappear. He knew about rogue waves but he said seeing one that big, and that close, and watching it suddenly just vanish was so creepy and shocking that he was literally stunned for a minute. User replies. What's funny is that rogue waves weren't even really confirmed by the scientific community until the later half of the 20th century. People just disappeared. Contract mariner. I disappear into the blue area for 6 to 8 months a year. Creepy? Not much honestly. The sound of moaning steel due to slack tanks when you're rolling really hard can be a bit unnerving. St. Elmo's fire is pretty neat. Fata Morgana aka, the Flying Dutchman, is pretty cool to see in real life. After a while the only thing out there that really spooks you is a problem you have that directly influences your survival. All the spooky shit I've ever been a part of have been no bullshit emergencies. Fire in the engine control room? I'm the first responder down there to see if it's an actual emergency or a fucked up concilium sensor. Wall of toxic smoke from burning electronics and the high voltage room? Oh fuck. Have an emergency weather sortie because we are dragging anchor and rolling 30 degrees with 50 feet UKC and we're getting pushed toward the island? Fuck me, 10 shots ain't enough, we are about to run aground in a 55,000 ton 800 feet ship. Pucker factor. Oops, now we get the hookup to get the fuck out of there, we immediately lose steering and propulsion. Good shit. I've seen brand new $1 million sport fishers capsized and bobbing around like a cork 1,000 miles from land. I've seen tiny little songbirds skipping along the surface just barely clinging to life, but they're flying as hard as they can to find land. Some of the saddest shit I've ever seen are those little birds skipping off the water as they fly further out to sea hoping to all fuck they come across some land. I dunno. I'm on the Yangling at a port bar and I'm rambling. To answer your question TLDR style, the creepiest thing about being out there are the bottomless depths of sadness, loneliness and heartache. You will go places in your mind that words will never be able to do any justice in trying to describe. Creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, and when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point with sand all around us and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest though was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. It turned into a massive, delirious argument over where everyone was even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal, and the captain put us all in a terrible situation due to sheer incompetence. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights and they did not show up on AIS. Suddenly they were gone. It was extremely creepy. Oh hey, one I can actually answer. So this isn't the creepiest story, I'll admit that straight off. I was working on a tiny oil rig off the Gulf Coast. It was about 2 p.m. I was on what was called sliver duty. Basically you wait in between 2 relatively close together walls on the exterior of the rig, strapped into a safety harness, while someone skirts through a long flow cable that you direct. Boring, but you get a nice view of the ocean for an hour or 2. Suddenly my buddy on the other end of the sliver starts screaming to look down. I do and saw the biggest sea creature I've ever seen in my life. End to end it must have been the size of most rural hospitals I've seen. Just pushing below the surface of the water, it raised its head out and I realized I was really dumb and was staring at an undersea cable placer. Right. Long-time lurker, first-time poster here. I'm no longer at sea but used to as a younger chap with romantic ideas spend months on end on cargo ships. Mostly tankers, crude oil VLCC and refined product tankers, but with a little time in oil and gas and towing, I came ashore in 2017 with a Master Unlimited ticket, sailing as chief officer. My last ship was a self-discharging bulk carrier. Anyway, I digress. It wasn't so much about what I saw, which was creepy. I saw plenty of interesting things I wouldn't have seen anywhere else. However, I was second mate on a tanker distributing refined oil products around the coast of New Zealand. A yacht had sailed from a port on the east coast, bound for another port just down the coast a bit, but it had disappeared. Solo sailor on board, aside from his dog. Nonetheless, the search proved fruitless and it was suspended. However, for weeks afterwards at about 1:30 in the morning, the Rescue Coordination Center would broadcast a plea at the end of the weather and navigation warning broadcast asking for the yacht to make contact, if it could hear the message and was able to do so. I'd sit in the dark, chain smoking, working on my 7th cup of coffee, looking out into the black, imagining the guy who's had a stroke or heart attack on board with the same broadcast playing out on his radio while his dog ate his face to keep from starving. Or imagining him having fallen over the side, imagining what it'd be like watching your yacht sailing indifferently off into the distance with your dog in the cockpit pacing and agitated, unable to do anything about it. Knowing you were fucked and had a matter of hours, if that left to live before the cold got you or exhaustion. Or, imagining the dog starving and dying on a yacht by itself weeks later, listening to the same broadcast in the dark. The places your mind goes in the dark by yourself. They found the yacht in the end. The dog was still alive. Well, that's it. You made it to the end of the video. Thanks a ton for watching. And to all you amazing subscribers out there, you're the real MVPs. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.